morning, folks. As always, you're welcome to this week's Let's Talk Dairy webinar. Today, as always, we're joined by a Grass10 team member, Joseph Dunphy's joining us from the field as such to the farm work this morning. So we'll touch on that in a minute, Joe. So we appreciate your time. And after that, then Michael Dineen, Senior Research Officer in Moore Park, is going to give us maybe an overview of the National Winter Milk Open Day took place in Johnstown Castle last week. So some of the main take-home messages. We'll have a chat with Mike on that. Once we've got an update in the grass situation, Joe. So I suppose fire away from the front seat of your car as such. So it's never more connected to what's happening on the ground. Tell us, how are the figures looking?
Yeah, good morning to all your viewers and listeners again, James. So we're here for our final Grassland Farmer of the Year event, the pinnacle of the overall winner of the 2022 Grassland Farmer of the Year. We're here with Diarmuid and Sean Fitzgerald here in Cratloe in County Clare here today. So they were the overall winners last year. Great operators, super amount of clover on the farm, growing 13.5, 14 ton from about in around 150 kilos of N going out on the platform. So, very good morning here in store. The weather seems to, we've been breaking the weather until the heavy rain later on this evening and overnight. So yeah, it's opened up lovely here. So hopefully a good day in ahead. Very, very quickly, I suppose, James, just on the figures, the pasture-based figure for the week in around 900 of an average farm cover. Again, growth rates for the last week still staying fairly strong in around 60. I suppose on the back of the previous week of good weather, it has got noticeably chillier over the last few mornings. We're really getting that autumnal feel to it now. Cover per livestock unit in around 300 and cover for livestock in around 300 kilos of dry matter per hectare. Pre-grazing yield just in over 2,000 at the minute, and in around in about a diet of 3 kilos of meal and 15 kilos of grass still going in. So in general, a good position to be in. We're probably, I know this year's had its challenges, James, but we're a lot of farmers are on track. They're in a good position.
Probably more grass, Joe, on farms than usually would be at this stage. And normally when we're having this conversation, we'd say we're behind target. Maybe not as much grass out there as we'd like. So there is, what you're telling us ultimately is there's plenty of grass out there on the vast majority of farms. It's about managing it from here on in. Is that the message?
That's the message, and I suppose we're off the back of a couple of super weeks, which has allowed a lot of people to get stuff, maybe a bit of third cut tidied up or bales done on mouth farms and whatever needed to be done. I suppose, as you said, pre-grazing yields are above 2,000. Some people maybe have covers of well over 1,000 at this stage. It's just, I suppose, utilizing those heavy covers, picking the right day to go to them is the thing. And especially for the south and the east of the country, there is a good bit of rainfall expected over the next few days. So it's about trying to picking the right paddock now on the right day, not going into those very heavy covers when there's very heavy rain expected, just to get that utilization. We're after putting it there. Let's try and make as good a use of it as we can.
Yeah, very, very good. Obviously, fertilizer ceased now on farms. So, and there should have been a lot of slurry, I suppose, got out there. Conditions were favourable over the last few weeks. So really now the attention turns to getting the farm set up right for next spring. And just what should people be doing in terms of setting up rotation planners and feed budgets, and something it's often underused at farm level, Joe?
Yeah, well, I suppose if you look at this week's newsletter, James, it kind of probably takes us through from the second half of September, into the closing position now. So really, we want to be pushing out to a 30 to 35 day round at the minute, and build into that peak cover on the farm, because, in general, growth will drop back to demand on a lot of farms now this week with the cooler temperatures. So again, look at this week's newsletter. The autumn grazing targets are in to try and get to maybe that, depending on if you're stocked in around 3, try and get to maybe 350, 370 per cow. which is, in around the 1050 to 1100 of a farm cover and 35 days of a rotation length. Okay. I suppose for heavier soils, I suppose an important point to make, we're trying to keep that between 900 and 950 and no pre-grazing yields above 1800. So again, use the grazing targets for the autumn and put that into a budget. I suppose just one last piece there, James, just on the I suppose the nitrogen deadline today, I suppose just a few key points. There is a good bit of rainfall expected over the next day or two. So I just be, worry about people spreading fertilizer today. If people are, a lot of it today or something like that, there is a lot of rainfall expected. And I suppose the key point from our point of view is that we've 2 weeks left now until the slurry deadline. So to tactically use your dairy washings and light slurry now on grazed paddocks is the key thing. So if you have a bit of dairy washings left and there's a little bit of slurry left in tanks, mix them up, agitate them in well. And those paddocks now that are grazed now from the 14th on to the end of the year, just to give them that little bit of nitrogen, bit of P and K, use your dairy washings and your slurry tactically.
Especially, I suppose, if there is farmers listening ultimately that have clover and grass clover paddocks, really in terms of that P and K, if we can target it at those, it's going to be beneficial over that period, isn't it?
Yeah, perfect. Just lastly, James, one quick point. As I said, we're on the farm today for the Grassland Farm of the Year, and I suppose once we finish 1 year, we start another year. So if on this week's news there's an interview with John Marr from the Grass10 team and John O'Loughlin there that was recorded with Emma Louise on the Dairy Edge. And I suppose there's a link there as well. So, if you want to give it a go in terms of applying for next year's Grassland Farm of the Year competition, if you're doing a good job on farm, good grass clover, good nutrient management, put yourself forward. And
unlike most things, I think there's an increased first prize for people. I think this year most things it's been a reduction in terms of the economics, but this year from what I see, there's a pretty good first prize there, Joe. So
yeah, it's up to 10,000 now, so that's well worth going after. Yeah, so
if you're not in, you can't win type of thing. Come here, we appreciate your time. I understand that you are busy in terms of setting up for this morning, so the very best of luck with the overall Grassland Farmer of the Year winner walk today. And we'll talk to some of you next week. All right, Joe?
Okay, thanks, James. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks a million. Bye-bye.
Yep.
So as I said earlier, folks, Michael Dineen is joining us. Mike, we had a very successful in terms of National Winter Milk Open Day last week in Johnstown Castle. Big attendance, but I suppose what we wanted to do, given the geography in terms of it can be a significant journey, and the weather was good, and I know there was plenty of messages in terms of apologies that people that maybe couldn't make it. Just have a conversation for the next 10 or 15 minutes, Mike, in terms of maybe some of the main key messages, key discussion points on the day in terms of where they were at. So I suppose firstly, thanks for coming on to me, and you're obviously in terms of the main principal research officer down there, Mike, in terms of heading up the research. Johnstown Castle is the main hub for that winter milk research, and that's kind of where we started the day. We'll maybe run through the 5 stops, Mike, but David Wall would have opened up with that, and maybe just give us a feel in terms of maybe the history of Johnstown Castle and what has been done there over the last few years.
Yeah, no, 100%. Thanks for having me on, James. And good morning, everyone. So, I'm very fortunate that I get to team up with the likes of Aidan Lawless and the team down in Johnstown Castle, and it's very enjoyable. They're really driving on operations down there, and it is a great opportunity. So delighted to link up with yourself and Joe Patton as well, and the rest of the team for the open day. So really enjoyed it. The first board, David Wall, enterprise leader in Johnstown Castle, he opened it up for us. So he welcomed the cohort of farmers, and he kind of got into the history of the dairy herd in the Johnstown Castle. So in 2003, the herd would have been set up, and it was set up to be the main base for winter milk research in Teagasc, and the thought process was to have it as the centre for research, training and dissemination. So it's a great asset to have down there and help drive things forward for the winter milk cohort. David touched on past research. So there'll be a history down there of a number of people supporting Aidan and the team down there in terms of research. So there'll be John Murphy, Patrick French would have been there for a time, and then Joe Patton would have led it from a research perspective since 2009. So Joe did a great job down there, in fairness to him. They would have got into things like grazing strategies for autumn and spring winter milk herds. So kind of covers in the autumn would have been the big one. That fresh cow getting into the higher covers, what was optimal for her. They would have went after EBI and cow type and a lot of very good and interesting work out of that. They were touched on feed to yield systems, so comparing feed to yield to flat rate. And then more recently, they would have got into kind of calving patterns. What's the optimal amount of cows to calve in the autumn in split herds and how that affects the financials and the premiums involved there as well. So David gave a really nice background there and welcomed everyone to the day. And we took off up through the fields then to get to the technical boards.
So we went for a walk then as such, and I suppose tease people in terms of the first stop really was around Johnstown Castle, the winter milk herds. Aidan Lawless, farm manager, would have presented that. I suppose, what was the main points from that to be taken, I suppose, from the performance of the Johnstown Castle, and maybe can you just outline that for our listeners, Mike, in terms of where it's actually at?
Yeah, 100%. So yeah, the first technical board, it was focusing on the herd and the cow type, and Aidan would have delivered that. Aidan being the farm manager, and then the second part of that board was kind of pasture management and maximizing grass in the winter milk cow's diet. And Vincent Tracy, a Teagasc Advisor in Mead, with a large cohort of winter milk producers, delivered that board and did a great job on it. So a nice thing too we had in the background was the yearling heifers were there on show as well. So Aidan talked through some of the management around those animals as well, and we had some information on how they're doing. So the main takeaways from Aidan's board with the herd profile, he would have talked through the EBI and that we're striving for a very high EBI cow down there. And that there's no differentiation between the autumn calving and spring calving. They're very similar genetically. They're a high EBI cow, high milk and fertility subindex, driving for high milk components to deliver our high milk solids, and then a really functional cow so that we can maximize the pasture utilization for the majority of her lactation once she gets to grass there in late January, early February. So the herd will be over 200 EBI, about 208 on average in the July run. And then in terms of calving and fertility, so Aidan runs 2 10-week compact calving periods, one in the spring and one in the autumn. The cows are actually calving now at the moment. The first 3 of them just calved down there for the autumn herd. That begins around the 12th to the 15th of September, and mean calving date would be the 9th of October down there typically. So cows will be calving September, October, November, and a nice compact period. In terms of fertility, so we pulled together results over the past 5 years. Pregnancy rate to first service for the autumn herd was about 57%. So target there of around 60. So we're happy enough with that one. 6-week calving rate around 78%. And a 10-week empty rate of 13%. So a little high on our empty rate. I suppose it is a 10-week, important to state that, but we'd like to pull that down a little bit, and it's variable year to year. Some years are better than others, but 13 as an average would be comfortable enough. But we'd definitely strive to get it down. And then calving interval, a very important one in winter milk systems, calving interval of 370 days. And we put big emphasis on that to have no recycled cows between the spring and the autumn. So that can be a challenging one out on farm. There's an emotional part of it of keeping certain cows, but we have a strict policy of no recycling down in Johnstown.
So really, I suppose what I'm getting there is high EBI genetics. Cows are the same for both the autumn and the spring. And it's really about delivering in terms of fertility performance, and then having cows that are capable of producing high levels of milk solids. What sort of performance was the herd, or has the herd been delivering over the last number of years?
Yeah, so you're dead right. Kind of set the basics, get that high EBI cow, good fertility performance. It's across all systems. It's critical to hit those. So cumulative performance. So we pulled it again over the last 4 to 5 years. On average, the autumn herd produced 7,540 kilos of milk, a fat percent of 4.52 and a protein percent of 3.66. So fairly good milk composition there, and that delivers 616 kilos of milk solids on average for those autumn calving cows. Their body weight is 604, and in terms of cumulative concentrate fed, it hits around 1.6 ton across the whole lactation. So about 1,000 of that, 900 to 1,000 coming during the winter feeding period, the kind of 100 to 100 day period, and then 600 during the grazing season. So we've tried to get good response to concentrate when we're on those in-soil forages. But once they go to grass, it's lean. We try to, once we have the supply of high quality grass, we're pulling back on the concentrate and really focusing on maximizing grass in the diet, be it a spring or an autumn cow. Once we've that supply of high quality grass, we utilize it.
And that's really creeping into, I suppose, the second half of the board there in terms of concentrate uses, as you said, once they get the grass, ultimately in terms of you're reducing concentrate down to a couple of kilos probably after that spring period, and that's where a lot of the mismanagement in terms of concentrates probably is used on winter milk farms. Vincent's messages then, I suppose.
So
and a lot of the time it's different. You know, winter milk systems are different or such. Is it that different at all? I suppose from a grassland to pasture management point of view.
Yeah, so Vincent did a great job, and I think the board worked out lovely. So we kind of set it out. We did spring, summer, autumn. And we looked at the kind of grazing management practices around there. And I mentioned Joe and Aidan would have worked hard on that in past years. So a nice solid foundation. And when we really went through it, spring and summer are essentially the same as a spring calving herd. So in terms of turnout, when we're planning our indoor feeding experiments, we have to be conscious that Aidan, if the weather comes in late January, cows are going out. So there's no such thing as holding them back and getting them into March to keep the amount of in-soil forage in the diet. It's once the grass is there and the weather and soil conditions allow, cows are heading out. Aidan will utilize 2 to 3 hour grazing bouts if it's inclement weather. He'll get the kind of on-off grazing going there. And then in terms of targets, it's like your spring herd. We'll be trying to get 33% by the end of February, 66 by Paddy's Day, and then early April for second rotation. And then again, Aidan be walking once a week in the spring period, and based on grass supply, he'd be pulling back on the winter forages and getting them out of the diet at the earliest possibility. Onto the summer then, very similar. We use the wedge, the summer grazing targets, keeping nice pre-grazing yields. And the only slight difference maybe is that the first cut silage, we really focus on getting that in the first half of May as soon as we can. And we'll be aiming for over 74 DMD silage for those winter milk animals. So we're really focusing on getting that high quality silage to be able to pull back on the concentrate then during the housing period. The autumn comes along then. That's the kind of slightly different to grazing management to the spring one. So essentially Aidan and the team, they won't build the farm cover as high as maybe in spring situations. So we have that fresh cow. We're trying to get her to utilize the grass well. So we'll keep max pre-grazing yield around 1,800. And peak average farm cover, we try to keep it around 950. So that'll be more challenging this year with the good growth. But that's the kind of targets we'd aim for. We tried to have 75% of the area closed by early November. And then we tried to keep in-soil forages out of the diet until the start of November. So we tried to maximize, again, grass in the diet with a slightly higher average farm cover of 650 being the target, just so we have slightly more supply of pasture in the spring when we have that big demand coming along with the mid-lactation cows at that stage. So,
So really, I think that's the important point from that board, Mike, ultimately, is that there's still a massive focus from a feed budget perspective on forage utilised, forage quality, grass for as long a period as possible, and then where not, that it's high quality in-soil silage.
Definitely, 100% critical. Like it's our best resource there, our high quality pasture. So that's getting into the diet as much as possible. Yeah.
Very good. And then maybe stop 2 and 3 were more related to the research that has been carried out over the last couple of years. So in terms of our second stop, really looking at, I suppose, protein sources within our concentrate and maybe the importance of soya and what it actually does, and is there alternatives there, Mike? So maybe just give us a brief kind of rundown in terms of the work, and I suppose in terms of maybe then you'll point out the further work that needs to be done as well.
Yeah, so that was the third technical board. So Neil Maher, he's a PhD student focusing on winter milk systems. So himself and myself presented that board, and it was kind of trying to keep the momentum going as Joe was transitioning out of the role down there. We tried to carry on the flag there and keep things going with Aidan and the team. So the kind of context around that work, or the protein source work, is that there's incentive and policy coming to try reduce the amount of imported feeds into our systems. So primarily soybean meal. There's lots of policy like the climate action plan. And the idea around it, I suppose, is that there's a number of concerns with those imported ingredients. There's obviously the carbon footprint to get them here. They're typically coming from deforested land. There's price volatility with them, and we're kind of exposed to that. There's geopolitical disruptions. So unfortunately, we're seeing that in the news with the war in Ukraine. And there's then the overall product marketability, kind of our homegrown Irish origin green credentials. So we set up experiments to try to see if we replace these imported feeds with homegrown feeds, how does it affect the performance of winter milk cows? And overall, when we've tried to replace them, we typically see during that indoor feeding period, when the cows are on in-soiled forages, we see about a 15 to 20 kilo of milk solids reduction over the kind of 8 to 10 week period. So about 0.2 kilos of milk solids per day. So we ran 2 years, 3 years of that kind of research. We ran it where there was no maize silage, and then we ran it again where we just isolated the protein ingredients, switching soya and maize distillers for field beans and rapeseed meal, and we saw consistent reductions in performance when it was making up a considerable amount of the diet. So there's lots of literature out there to support that soya is very rich in terms of its amino acid profile and metabolizable protein. Field beans are quite degradable in the rumen. So our challenge now is to try overcome that reduction in performance and see, can we bridge the gap and be able to utilize these ingredients in our diets without losing performance. So there's technologies like rumen protected amino acids. We could process the field beans potentially. There's alternative ingredients like lupins and peas. And then, of course, there's the base forage. So looking at silage digestibility and alternative forage sources like red clover. So important point to emphasize there, I suppose, is we really pushed it to its max. We tried replacing all the soya with these homegrown sources. So currently in the industry, that wouldn't be what you'd be purchasing. So the reduction in performance is very unlikely to be as much as we're seeing here in the research. And the other point is that there's very good work from UCD in the grazing scenario. So where they've fed field beans at lower inclusion levels and at lower feeding rates, and very similar performance between the homegrown ingredients and imported soya. So just to take that with a word of caution, that when we go full hog in a winter milk system, that's where we seem to lose performance. But in an industry perspective right now, it's unlikely to see that type of reduction in performance. So the take home from that was these homegrown ingredients can really help our carbon footprint. Donal O'Brien would have shown that by the switches we've made, we reduced the carbon footprint by 30% of the milk. It drives up our protein self-sufficiency, so it protects us from price volatility and disruptions. It helps our tillage sector, our friends in the tillage sector, so it's helping achieve those targets, and there's a lot of benefits to the likes of field beans in their rotations. But the word of caution is the reduced performance in those winter milk systems.
Yeah. But as you say, in terms of continued research, in terms of really no pressure, Mike, but your job now is to close that gap as such. We've seen the importance of soya ultimately in that overwinter period. and it's about tweaking that and seeing is there a way ultimately that performance gap can be closed.
Definitely.
Which
And we must do bigger modelling as well, like LCA modelling and economics, and is the winter milk herd the right place to be putting the beans that we can grow? And there's all those broader questions to target as well. So
there's actually a good question in there. If the diet used the maximum of Irish cereals and beans, but topped up with some soya, would you achieve performance benefits? So that's really the point you were making there in terms of should there be an inclusion of beans and soya?
Yeah. So very good question, and it'd be kind of a titration approach. Like we went one or the other. Could you go kind of in the middle? I suppose from a research perspective, we wanted to push it to the extremes, and then the other part is that when you really maximize the field beans, that's when you're getting your 30% reduction in carbon footprint. So if you pull back on the beans, you're going to pull back on those benefits as well in terms of carbon and environmental. But definitely, and that's what's happening in the industry at the moment, there's only a certain amount of beans grown in Ireland, and that doesn't you can't essentially have the full replacement that we researched at the moment. Those growing targets are changing. There's more and more hectares coming into field beans, so it's about working together and figuring out where's the best place for those beans and how to include them in diets.
Yeah, very, very good. And then the next up, I suppose, and a bit that could be critical right across the industry and not only associated in terms of with winter milk, but the study was done over that winter milk period, is, I suppose, reducing methane emissions and doing that through the use of a feed additive. So explain to us in terms of the study that was trialed last winter in Johnstown Castle and the results that were presented on the day with regards to that, Mike.
Yeah, so that last kind of technical research board was on reducing methane production of winter milk cows. Ben Lahart, research officer here in Teagasc, and myself presented that board. So Ben would have opened up and kind of set the scene of where we're at with methane emissions and the need to reduce them. And he recovered some of the research done in Moore Park. So they've gone very hard after it the last few years here, looking at making sure we have the correct baseline. So we're being fair to that cow, what she's actually emitting, and making sure the inventories are set up correctly. He would have discussed some of the benefits of seasonality. So the reductions they're seeing when spring grass is in the diet, and around the quality of that pasture as well. They're seeing that lower herbage swards can reduce methane intensity. He also discussed genetics, EBI, and the role that has in helping reduce our methane. And then finally, he touched on feed additives. So there's a broad array of feed additives. You'd all see it in the popular press and in the media, and the potential promising solutions coming from there, and the kind of criteria of what they have to meet to be able to be a successful solution. So I suppose the overall message from Ben's side was that there's a number of solutions available to us at the moment, not to focus on one or think there's a silver bullet. But in terms of feed additives, we did go after a certain additive, which was 3-NOP. It's essentially an enzyme that inhibits the final step of methane formation. And there's very promising literature internationally in the indoor confinement system in terms of its ability to reduce methane. So our challenge was to investigate that in an Irish context, in Irish winter milk cows, and see does it stand up to other international research. They would have done some work here in Moore Park with the 3-NOP, and they would have seen that it's difficult when the cows aren't getting a consistent supply of it throughout the day for the ingredient to have a benefit as much as seen in the literature. So in terms of the Irish winter milk cow, she's getting it at the feed barrier during that winter feeding period, and she's consistently eating it across the day. So it was a very promising place to potentially use it. So we set up two experimental diets. Exactly the same in terms of grass silage, maize silage, and concentrate inclusion levels. The only difference was that the control had no additive, and then the additive diet had the 3-NOP included in it. We fed 1.8 grams of 3-NOP per day, and it was fed very practically. So Aidan and the team would have had a 10-kilo bucket of the ingredient, and they would have hand mixed it into the loader bucket with the concentrate that was then added to the mixer wagon. So very practical and very high ability to be able to be performed on farm. So we ran that for 7 weeks. Ben and Hazel Costigan were huge in coming down and helping set up the green feeds and helping us run the experiment. Neil Maher was the PhD student running it. And of course, Aidan and his team couldn't have got it done without them. So we ran it for 7 weeks. In terms of results, in terms of milk production, we saw a slight increase in milk yield and a slight increase in protein percent. So that delivered a slight increase in milk solids yield. So the control group with no 3NOP would have produced 2.45 kilos of milk solids over that 7-week indoor feeding period. And the additive cows would have produced 2.5 kilos of milk solids. So a 2% increase in milk solids yield. And then the kind of really crucial ones, we looked at absolute methane, so the grams of methane per cow per day. The control cows produced 447 grams, whereas the additive cows that received the 3NOP produced 330 grams per day. So that was a 26% reduction in absolute methane per day. In terms of methane intensity, so the amount of methane per kilo of milk solids, the control cows produced 182 grams of methane per kilo of milk solids, and the 3NOP fed cows produced 132 grams. So that was a 27% reduction in methane intensity. So essentially, it stood up to the experiments. It did similar to what it has shown in international research. So I suppose the really strong positive around that is now that we've proven it in an Irish scenario, and it can potentially be incorporated into the inventories and be used as a solution for reducing agricultural methane production. So very promising in that sense. But I suppose going back to Ben's initial board, it's important to state there's a number of solutions now available. We need to utilize all of them. EBI and high quality pasture and maximizing grass in the diet are very positive in a number of senses, not only for methane reduction. Feed additives will be a solution or a tool there, but of course we must keep driving it on and find other solutions and have a wide array of tools to help meet our targets going forward.
And one question there, Mike, ultimately, I suppose that reduction that you would have seen in that period in terms of the methane reduction, where does that stack in terms of that international work? Is that similar? Did we see a greater response? Did we see less of a response? Where does that stand?
Yeah, so we were roughly average, I suppose. When you look at meta-analyses, that's where they take all the experiments done so far. They'd be hitting around 30% on average, some slightly higher, some slightly less. And they've dug into why it has different responses at times. And they would have looked at things like NDF or fiber in the diet or the amount of fat in the diet, and that can affect it. So the more fiber, the more of a response, whereas the higher oil, the less of a response. So there's kind of mechanisms behind why there's certain responses, but I suppose overall very positive. We're in or around average. We're achieving similar to other countries when they use the solution.
Very good, very good. And I suppose that led us on ultimately then to the last stop, Mike. Not going to ask you to give the overview of this.
You're the man for that one. Yeah.
I was actually presenting it. So myself, along with local dairy advisor Kay O'Connell, I suppose in terms of where we wanted to conclude from our technical boards really was the whole area of costs associated with winter milk. And we all know costs across the board going from 2021 into 2022, and unfortunately our analysis, Mike, would show that 2023 costs are going to remain very, very similar, both across manufacturing herds, but I suppose in the context of this, they really across liquid milk herds. So we would have presented analysis there that would have showed in terms of the average cost of keeping the winter liquid milk cow in 2021 was €1,934. And from our analysis in terms of our e-profit monitor analysis, that actually rose to €2,397 in 2022. So there was an increase of just over €460 of additional costs inside one production year. As I said, on the day, to a degree, obviously, in terms of it's a significant issue in the fact that they remain sticky. But in 2022, milk price and farm gate milk prices tracked that, and even I suppose towards the end of the year, actually, the differential would have become greater. But as we moved into 2023, farm gate milk prices have dropped off. We all know where the situation is with regards to those at the moment, and costs remain high, which is a real concern. So I suppose the main messages there, Mike, from ourselves ultimately was know your costs. Break even and full economic costs of milk production at farm level will be higher than just total variable and fixed costs. Ultimately, capital repayments, taxation, and drawings have to be factored in at individual farm level. So the big one there is, if you don't already know your costs of production, sit down, do your benchmarking analysis in terms of your e-profit monitor, have an understanding in terms of where your costs are at. A big one, and it often comes up in debate in industry in terms of we're in a higher cost system, obviously, in terms of we're producing more milk over that indoor house period. But that doesn't mean, and when we look at our analysis, it doesn't mean that we should forget about the overall cost of production, because what we see is the winter milk and liquid milk farms that ultimately keep a handle on costs are the farms that consistently deliver margins, even in lower milk price years. So that's important, and that's really that's all related to the feed budget. 49% of total cost is actually related to the feed budget, Mike. So it comes down to, it actually comes straight back to the board. The second half of the board that Vincent presented, really in terms of making sure that we're utilizing lots of forage, that it's high quality grass in those periods where we can, and then that it's high quality silage. One thing that does fit into that, I suppose, is stocking rate. And sometimes this idea that we're a liquid milk farm, liquid milk system, we can carry a higher stocking rate. If we're relying on excess imports of feed, the margins on that are on a reducing scale. So that's just something to remember. Yeah. So that was the first half, Mike, really. And yeah, for each individual, the messages there is know your costs.
Yeah. And Kay would have done a great job then on the second half, and kind of to your points there, know your costs and control what you can, and things like EBI, stale cows, getting a good calving interval, and then maximizing grass and high quality silage. So things that are controllable within the farm gate. So she did a great job on that too, in fairness, and really tied the whole boards together and brought the messages forward. So.
And you're right there, Mike, in terms of really, and that was the final point in terms of, we just had a quick look at where the average figures are at. And I suppose where we're really losing, and you alluded to it in terms of, is that fertility performance. Too many cows on farms in stale milk production. There's always the tendency in terms of, oh, well, sure, if she doesn't go in calf, we can move her to the next calving pattern. But that is a detrimental impact. And Joe would have talked about that through the years. And it's obvious when you look at individual farm performance and right across groups here, calving intervals well above 400 days. So really the three focus areas that Kay would have spoke about was genetics, calving pattern, and forage utilised. And if we got those three things right in terms of the correct genetics, high EBI genetics, high fertility subindex, milk subindex really driven off a high level of combined fat and protein rather than maybe excessive kilos of milk. And Aidan would have said 100 kilos, 120 kilos is kind of where his target is for kilos of milk, but it's plus 35 kilos of solids in terms of genetics he's looking for. Yeah. Then the calving pattern stuff really is 2 defined blocks, have a start date and end date, and ultimately keep that recycled number of cows below 5%. So in every 100 cows, there should be 5 golden tickets, as Kay spoke about. We'll allow 5 favourites as such if we got it to that level. We'd love to see none, but in a lot of cases, we're seeing 15, 18% recycled cows, which ultimately is really diluting performance and feed efficiency. Yeah. The last point of Kay's was that forage utilised point. directly related to profitability, no matter what system we look at. And we actually done an interesting bit of work a few years ago where we actually looked at the relationship between forage utilised in winter systems and also in spring manufacturing systems. And actually the correlation was nearly identical in terms of the correlation between it and profitability. So it's as important in our winter systems in terms of forage utilised. Yep. So those were the main points, Mike. And I suppose the big one there is that EBI works across all systems and we don't need a different type of cow, and focus on the feed budget to increase margins, you know.
Yeah. And then Miriam Gunn from Strokestown and Roscommon, and Joe would have picked up the calving interval aspect again in the forum. Then afterwards, they did a really nice job. And Miriam mentioned the golden tickets for the 5 of them. And Joe would have elaborated on taking the emotion out of it if possible, and tried to maximize the lifetime productivity of those cows. Like you're saying, don't have them stale. So we consider her, she's still making 20-25 kilos, but it's lost opportunity when she could be back around as a fresh cow again and up around 35-40 potentially. So they did a great job there as well in the forum on that point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the forum really tied it together because we had an opportunity in terms of hearing from Miriam, as you said, in terms of her own farming system, the changes that they've made in terms of genetics, improving the fertility performance, improving the components. And she very clear in terms of her culling policy. The decision to cull cows isn't made at the end of the year. It's ultimately made throughout the year. And I think if our listeners got anything from that is, ultimately, if a cow, if the decision to cull a cow needs to be made, it actually should be made and recorded at that particular period, rather than leaving the decision to the end of the year or whatever it is. Because what happens then, Mike, is the tendency is to resubmit her and breed her and away we go again type of thing. Yeah. So
she mentioned using beef semen as well on certain cows. Make sure be very selective for those heifers coming in as a replacement. So that was my point too.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously then in terms of the forum, there would have been a conversation in terms of around nitrates, the impact of nitrates, and that was well discussed and a lot of discussion around it. And I think the key point there ultimately is that decisions need to be made at an individual farm basis. Sit down, no more than your costs, know your figures, and make the correct decision for your farm. And that's going to be different for every farm ultimately. So really know your figures, make those decisions on an individual basis, have a conversation with your advisor in terms of what's the best for your farm going forward. So overall, Mike, I think a very positive day. Lots of tough discussion and talking points along the way, but ultimately that's what the day is about. An opportunity to see the research, and also in terms of an opportunity, I suppose, to reiterate the basics, and the basics ultimately to drive performance on across systems, not only winter milk systems.
Yeah, no, 100%.
So appreciate your time, Mike.
My pleasure. And before I run off, I just want to thank you too, James. You put in massive effort behind the scene there for that open day, and it's really appreciated. You drove around for the team and led us, which was great. Aidan and Ray Fox also massive effort. The place was looking smashing in fairness to them. Cows were in great nick and things were looking very well. And that's thanks to the farm staff too. Joe was heavily involved with us as well, not to be naming names. And then everyone that helped in the lead up and on the date is really appreciated, and couldn't do it without the team effort, and it was brilliant. Nice to get Moore Park and Johnstown working together below there as well. So
absolutely. In terms of, we had great collaboration across industry as well, which is I suppose which is massive. So come here, Mike. Appreciate the time. Hopefully our listeners will have enjoyed that. I think it's kind of a good snapshot in terms of what was discussed on the day. And as always, folks, I suppose farm safely over the remaining week. That we won't have an episode next week in terms of, because of the ploughing championships. I think everybody or nearly everybody will be making a trip to the ploughing championships one of the days next week, and I happen to be in it on Thursday, so we will follow up with an episode after that. So farm safely, folks, and thanks for tuning in. Thanks, Mike.
Take care. Thanks, everyone.